Varrock was tired. His bones ached under the weight of years of war, his senses dulled by time. The once vibrant hue of his scales, which had shimmered like the fiery rings of distant suns, now looked dull, weathered by age and countless battles. The Korun, a race of reptilian creatures known for their incredible strength, intelligence, and ferocity, had long ago been shattered by the devastating war with humanity. Now Varrock sat alone in the cold, sterile halls of the Korun Council Chamber, a place where decisions had once been made by a proud and powerful race. But today, it was silent. The walls of the chamber were adorned with holographic displays flickering with the history of their species, a history that now seemed irrelevant. The Korun were no longer the warriors they once were. The once mighty empire had crumbled, and the future felt as barren as the wasteland that surrounded them. It was no longer a time for conquests, it was a time for survival. Across the room sat the council, 12 figures garbed in ceremonial armor, each seated on a high platform above Varrock. They watched him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Few among the council had fought alongside him in the war against humanity. The majority were younger, untested in the fires of real conflict, and they were the ones who now held power. They had heard the tales, stories from older Korun who had barely survived the war, tales of humanity's relentless spirit, their ingenuity, and their victory against the Korun Empire. Varrock had been there. He had seen it firsthand, and his warning was simple, yet grave. "Humans cannot be underestimated," he said, his voice rough with age and pain. He leaned forward in his seat, his yellow eyes piercing through the council like a knife through the air. "I have seen their power. I have seen them fight, and I have seen them win." There was a collective murmur from the council members. Some looked at him with disdain, while others exchanged knowing glances. They didn't believe him, not fully. After all, that war had ended decades ago. Humanity's empire had been shattered just as easily as their own. Surely they were no longer a threat. After all, the Korun had rebuilt. They had adapted. New generations had come to power, and they had yet to see any sign that humans were capable of organizing another war of such scale. To many, humanity's survival had been a fluke, a victory in the chaos of battle. "Varrock," began Counselor Thoric, a tall and imposing figure draped in gleaming black armor, "you speak of old battles, old wars. Our enemies then are long gone, and we have moved on. The humans are nothing but a distant memory. You are nostalgic for a time that is no longer relevant. We face a different galaxy now." Varrock gritted his teeth. "You don't understand," he muttered. "I lived through the worst of it. The humans, they will never stop fighting. You think they've forgotten? You think they've given up? No, they're still out there, in the darkest corners of the universe, learning, evolving, waiting." One of the younger counselors, a female Korun with silver scales and sharp features, spoke up. "But why? Why would they come for us again? They've lost everything. Their own planet was destroyed. What is left for them to fight for?" Varrock looked up sharply, his nostrils flaring in anger. "That's the mistake, isn't it? You think they fight for resources or for planets. No. They fight because they are driven by something far deeper, a primal instinct, a hunger for survival, yes, but also a hunger for something more, something we don't have. They have something that we lost long ago, and that is why you should be afraid. Their desperation is their greatest strength." Thoric scoffed. "You are too consumed by your memories, Varrock. There is no place for this paranoia in our council. We are the future. We are Korun. We are beyond fear." Varrock stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the cold floor. His voice rose with a guttural intensity. "You haven't seen what I've seen. You haven't experienced the terror of their warfare. The humans don't just fight, they innovate. They adapt in ways we cannot comprehend. They can take what is old and make it new. They use whatever is at their disposal, no matter how crude. They will not give up, no matter how many times they are beaten. That is their greatest weapon. They do not stop." The chamber fell silent. Varroc's warning hung in the air like an oppressive cloud, suffocating the room. The council members shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, doubt crept into their minds. It was a subtle thing, a whisper at the back of their thoughts, but it was there. Finally, Thoric spoke, his voice much quieter now. "What do you want us to do, Varroc? You want us to retreat? To live in fear of a species that has already been defeated? How can you expect us to destroy our future over what you claim to be a fading ghost of the past?" Varroc's eyes narrowed, the pain of his memories resurfacing. He could see the faces of the Korun he had once fought alongside, fallen in battle, lost to the cunning and ferocity of humans. It was all so vivid, so real, the memories of burning worlds and the screams of his comrades. He clenched his fists. "No," he said slowly. "I want you to prepare. Prepare for the worst. I want you to understand that you will never see them coming, and when they do, it will be too late." At that, the council grew restless. Some exchanged glances, others seemed troubled, but the atmosphere had shifted. They could no longer ignore his words. The seed of fear had been planted, and though they didn't fully believe it, they couldn't dismiss it entirely. Several months passed after that tense council meeting. Varroc continued to live in isolation, his warnings growing louder in his mind, while the rest of the Korun moved forward with their plans for expansion. They ignored the veterans' advice, placing their trust in the idea that their species had advanced too far to be touched by the likes of humans. But then the first sign appeared. A ship, a small vessel by Korun standards, was detected on the outskirts of their space. It wasn't immediately recognized, and at first the Korun dismissed it as nothing more than a lost, derelict ship. There had been many over the years, pieces of wreckage from ancient wars, but this was different. The ship was far too intact, and it was moving, maneuvering through the space between star systems with an unexpected level of sophistication. The Korun sent out a fleet of reconnaissance ships, eager to examine the strange vessel. What they found, however, shattered their assumptions. It was a human ship. At first, the Korun were stunned. No human vessels had ventured this far into Korun space in decades. How could one have appeared now with no warning, no signal? The ship was too small to be a threat, but its presence was unsettling. And there was something about its design, a fusion of old and new technologies, an amalgamation of scavenged parts and cutting-edge engineering that made the Korun uneasy. The Korun fleet closed in on the vessel, surrounding it with their immense warships. They ordered the human ship to stand down and prepare for inspection, but the humans didn't comply. They didn't even acknowledge the Korun ships, instead continuing to move with the same erratic precision that had so confused the Korun fleet commanders. A transmission was sent from the human vessel, a single cryptic message that sent a chill down the spines of the Korun officers. "You have been warned." The words echoed through the comm channels, repeating themselves over and over. Then the human ship sped off, vanishing into the depths of space. Before the Korun could respond, Varroc watched the entire exchange from his quarters. He had known it was coming. He had known they would return, but even he hadn't anticipated the message. "You have been warned." It was a declaration. It was a promise. And as Varrock stood at the window of his chambers, staring out into the vast emptiness of space, he felt the weight of his own words crushing down on him. It was too late now. The humans were back. And this time, they weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting for something far more dangerous, something that would force the Korun to confront their own hubris. And Varrock knew, deep in his bones, that the war had just begun again. The Korun fleet drifted in the silent expanse of space, their sensors scanning the area with clinical precision. It was a typical morning, or at least as typical as anything could be in the wake of Varrock's warning. The Council had been at ease after the veterans' departure, resuming their expansion efforts and ignoring the old Korun's cries of alarm. They were too busy planning their next military campaign, too confident in their superiority. But Varrock's words clung to the air, lingering like a shadow over the proceedings, though no one dared speak of them aloud. They were trying to forget until the human ship arrived. The fleet had been monitoring the outskirts of their space when the blip appeared on the radar, too small to be a threat, at least at first glance. It had been detected coming from a far-reaching corner of the system, a region that was far from any known human colonies. Initially, it wasn't much more than a glitch on the radar. Korun technology was some of the most advanced in the galaxy, and it was accustomed to picking up debris, stray asteroids, and natural anomalies. But this was different. This anomaly was moving, drifting against the normal flow of space currents. It was as though something intelligent was controlling its course. Something human. Word spread quickly through the fleet. "Is it one of theirs?" came the low voice of Commander Zorath, a towering Korun with sharp features and a reputation for being particularly cautious when dealing with uncharted objects. He sat in the command center of the flagship, staring at the screen before him as the faint silhouette of the vessel appeared against the backdrop of distant stars. "Impossible," responded Lieutenant Shar, his tone dismissive, though his fingers danced nervously across the control panel. "Human ships don't venture out this far. It could be an old relic, some debris from the war." Zorath narrowed his eyes. "Scan for identification codes. Send a hail. If it's human, I want to know immediately." The crew moved quickly, as the quiet tension on the bridge was palpable. The ship was approaching at an almost deliberate pace, moving directly into Korun space, bypassing the multiple warning zones that had been set up in anticipation of potential threats. It was as though the human ship was daring the Korun to stop it, and to Zorath, that made it all the more dangerous. Shar's hands stopped, his expression changing from focused professionalism to confusion. "No identification signal, Commander. No known signature. It's not responding." Zorath frowned. His hand hovered over the communication panel, but before he could give the order to escalate, the ship's silhouette grew larger on the view screen. It was ragged, cobbled together in a way that was eerily familiar. It looked like a ship that had survived many battles, many repairs. The hull was scorched, the metal chipped and battered from years of use. Yet it was still intact and still functioning. "The humans," Zorath muttered under his breath, his voice laced with disbelief. "They're scavengers. How did they get a ship that far into our space?" He tapped a button to open the communication channel again. "This is Commander Zorath of the Korun fleet. You are entering restricted space. Stand down immediately and prepare to be boarded." There was a long, almost mocking pause. Then the small screen flickered to life. A human appeared. His face was haggard, rugged with years of space travel. His skin was weathered and scarred, his expression hard. But his eyes, the eyes were what struck Zorath most. They were tired, yes, but they were filled with something else, a deep, unyielding intensity that seemed to penetrate the very soul of the Korun. Why? The human said, his voice low, almost a growl. Why do you still do this? Why do you keep trying to push us back, as though you've already won? Zor stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. The words were strange, coming from a human. They were threatening, yet there was an odd vulnerability in the tone. The image flickered again, and a garbled noise filled the channel. "Commander, it's a warning," said the human, his voice finally clear. "You were warned, but you didn't listen. You'll regret it soon enough." Before Zorath could ask more, the human's image cut off, replaced by static. "End communication," Zorath ordered, his voice steady, though inside a storm was brewing. He turned to Shar. "Prepare to board. I want that ship captured. And bring me a full analysis of its capabilities." As the Korun fleet began moving into position, preparing for a confrontation with the unknown ship, the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just an ordinary scout. This was something far more deliberate, something personal. And it reminded Zorath of a time he had hoped to never revisit. Varric's warnings echoed in his mind. The humans weren't just soldiers. They weren't just another species to be conquered or ignored. No, they were a force, one unlike anything the Korun had ever faced before. He had thought it was all a myth, a fear stirred by an old warrior's wounds. But now, as the human ship drifted closer, he realized that the humans had learned, they had adapted, and the Korun had underestimated them. A team of Korun soldiers, heavily armored and ready for battle, gathered around the airlock. Zorath led the group, his posture rigid with authority. The air was thick with anticipation, the hum of the ship's engines vibrating through the corridor. "I don't like this," Shar muttered, his voice almost drowned out by the low hum of machinery. "This ship is too quiet. It's not right." Zorath nodded in agreement. His senses were alert, scanning for any irregularities. He could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about a border violation or a routine capture. It was a statement. The human ship had entered their space unprovoked, and its crew had all but dared them to stop it. The Korun had been too confident. Now they were facing the consequences. The airlock opened, revealing the interior of the human ship. The moment they stepped inside, the stench of old metal, sweat, and oil hit them. It was like stepping into a tomb. The place was eerily silent, save for the soft whirring of mechanical parts, as though the ship itself was alive. The corridors were narrow, tight, and crammed with machinery. None of it sleek or polished like Korun ships, but cobbled together with scraps of technology. Everything about the vessel screamed desperation, survival at any cost. Zorath gestured for his team to spread out and begin their search. The human ship was dark, its lights flickering as though it hadn't been fully functional in years. He tapped a device on his wrist, activating a scanning tool that flooded the ship's interior with low-frequency pulses, mapping out any life forms or hidden structures. The Korun soldiers spread out, their boots clanging against the metal floors as they moved silently through the hallways. Zorath's thoughts raced. How could a ship like this survive out here, so far from human colonies? Who was aboard? What had brought them here? Suddenly, a low hum echoed through the ship, followed by the sharp sound of metal scraping on metal. The Korgan froze, their weapons raised in an instant. The sound was coming from deeper in the vessel. Something, or someone, was moving. Zorth motioned for his team to fan out. His heart pounded in his chest as they moved through the dimly lit corridors, following the noise. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became, until it was suffocating. Then they reached the control room. There, standing alone in the center of the room, was a human. A woman this time. She was tall, slender, and battle-worn. Her hair was dark and tangled, her face smeared with grease and exhaustion. Her eyes locked with Zoreth's, and for a moment there was no movement. Just a tense standoff between the two species. Zoreth spoke first, his voice cold. "You are in violation of Korun space. Surrender now and you will be taken to our station for interrogation." The woman didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, a hint of amusement in her tired eyes. "Is that how this works now?" she asked, her voice hoarse but defiant. "You think you can intimidate us into submission?" Zoreth stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. "I'm not interested in games. Why have you come here? What do you want?" The woman's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "What do we want? We want to make sure you remember what you did. We want you to know that we're still here, and we want to make sure that you understand, this time, we're the ones in control." Her words echoed in the chamber, and for the first time Zoreth felt the unease he had been fighting all along. The Korun had been so sure of their victory, so certain of their dominance. Now, standing before this human, he realized how much they had underestimated their enemies. This was no longer about technology or firepower. This was a battle of wills. And humanity had never lost one of those. Varrock sat alone in his quarters aboard the distant Korun station, staring into the vast emptiness of space. His warnings had been ignored, and now the storm was beginning. He could feel it in the air, the same cold, ominous presence that had haunted his dreams during the war. The humans were back, and soon the Korun would feel the full weight of their mistake. Varrock closed his eyes, knowing that the galaxy had already begun to change again, and this time it would be too late to stop the tide. The human woman, standing amidst the hume of alien technology, never flinched as the Korun soldiers surrounded her. The metallic beams of the ship's control room reflected off her dirty face, her battle-worn features showing no sign of fear. Her sharp, calculating eyes locked onto Zoreth's, and it was as if the whole room shifted in a breathless moment of realization. Zoreth stood frozen for a moment, his hand hovering just above the hilt of his weapon, his instincts urging him to strike first, to quell the threat before it could spread. The unease in his chest was growing, gnawing at him, intensifying with every passing second. She wasn't afraid, and that terrified him more than any weapon ever could. "Do you think this is a victory?" Zorth's voice was low and measured, but it trembled slightly under the weight of his uncertainty. "You've breached our space, defied our command, and now you expect to walk away?" The woman finally moved, but only to step closer to the console at the center of the room. Her fingers danced over the worn surface, her movements deliberate, as if she were navigating through the ghosts of forgotten controls. She didn't even look at him as she spoke. "Victory? No, not yet. But maybe you should be asking yourselves a different question. Why did I come here? What do I want?" Zoreth took a step forward, his patience fraying, but his eyes didn't leave her. He motioned for his soldiers to advance, but something in the air stopped them. A strange kind of silence settled. Even the steady hum of the ship's systems felt muffled, distant, like the calm before a storm. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge the threat. She just continued working at the console. After a few seconds, the soft whirring of machinery echoed in the room as the ship's lights flickered briefly, and then the monitor in front of Zora displayed a series of shifting images. Maps. Coordinates. Locations that didn't make sense. And then suddenly a single word in red flashing across the screen. Doomsday. Zorath's mind raced, his pulse quickening. What is this? What are you showing us? The woman didn't look up, but her voice, barely a whisper now, made Zorath's blood run cold. You asked why we're here. It's not because we want to remind you of your past mistakes. It's because we've found something. Something you don't know exists, and it's going to destroy you. Her voice dropped to a near growl. You should have listened when you had the chance. The word doomsday burned itself into Zorath's thoughts as the ship's control panel blinked again. A series of rapid calculations appeared, and then there was a sudden, horrifying realization. The human ship's systems had synced with Koran defense grids. It was accessing their most secure military data. What have you done? Zorath demanded, the chill of panic creeping into his voice. The woman's lips curved slightly, and for the first time she finally turned to face him, her eyes glinting with a mixture of exhaustion and something more, something that made Zorath question everything he had thought he knew about his enemies. You have no idea what you're dealing with. You never did. Suddenly, alarms blared across the ship, breaking through the silence with a jarring intensity. Zorath's soldiers tensed, weapons drawn, ready to strike, but the woman's hands shot up, her fingers splayed in a gesture of calm surrender. She wasn't trying to escape. She was just waiting. What is this? Zorath growled, his focus shifting to the walls, to the rapidly blinking warning lights. What did you do to our systems? I didn't do anything, she replied, her voice eerily calm. Your own ship has just discovered what you've been hiding. Zorath's mind raced. He knew now. This wasn't just about some human ship sneaking into their space. This wasn't some isolated act of aggression. This was deliberate. What? What's coming? Zorath barely managed to whisper the words. The woman's gaze hardened. You'll see soon enough. But I can tell you this, you won't survive it, not alone. Without another word, she turned, stepping back toward the control panel, her fingers moving once again. She was no longer an enemy in the traditional sense. She wasn't a soldier, a prisoner, or even a threat. She was something far more dangerous. Someone who had already beaten them, simply by planting a seed of doubt in their minds. The walls of the Korun flagship began to tremble, a low, thrumming vibration moving through the ship, deep and unsettling. The lights above flickered violently, and the screens continued flashing the same ominous message. Doomsday. Zorath's pulse quickened. The realization was dawning on him. The human didn't need to fire a single shot, didn't need to use any of the weapons they had surely brought with them. The true danger wasn't in the ship or the human woman. It was in what she had unlocked, in what they had hidden from themselves for so long. There were no more words. Zorath motioned to his soldiers to take action. They began to advance, but as they did, the walls shook again, this time harder. A distant rumble echoed through the Korun flagship, reverberating like an incoming storm. Get to the control room, now, Zorath barked, the authority in his voice barely masking his own rising panic. But it was already too late. The entire ship shuddered violently as though something immense and unseen was pushing from the outside, straining against the very structure of the vessel. A series of loud cracks rang through the hull, followed by a deep guttural groan as the flagship's engines sputtered to life, though this time they seemed to be working against them. Zorath felt his stomach lurch as the ship's artificial gravity field began to flicker. "What the hell is happening?" he demanded, stepping back from the flickering control panel. The woman stepped away from the console and faced Zorath again. There was no fear in her eyes, only pity. "Your fleet is dying, Zorath. It was only a matter of time before you realized it." And then, without warning, a blinding light filled the room. The seconds after the light hit felt like hours to Zorath, his mind reeling as the world around him distorted and collapsed. The last thing he remembered was the human woman's gaze, one of quiet, bitter satisfaction, before the ship's systems overloaded and everything went black. When Zorath woke, he found himself in the wreckage of the flagship, surrounded by his comrades. The ship was broken, its once mighty engines reduced to smoldering fragments. Sparks flew from damaged panels and smoke filled the air, thick and acrid. The stench of burning metal and plasma hung in the air, choking the breath from his lungs. "Commander?" a voice whispered weakly. Zorath turned to see one of his soldiers lying on the floor in a heap, his body battered from the blast. His eyes were wide, full of fear. "What happened? What did they do?" Zorath didn't answer. He couldn't answer. All he could hear was the echo of the woman's final words in his mind. "Your fleet is dying." The ship's control room was in ruins. The walls were crumbling and the once pristine displays were now nothing more than shattered fragments, blinking erratically. But amid the wreckage, one image was still visible on the flickering screen. Doomsday. Zorath's heart sank. The truth had set in. The humans hadn't just warned them. They had known. And they had always known. The Korun had been deceived, and now the discovery was upon them.